All right, and we're live. So welcome to Tactical Podcast number 18. Today I've been really excited about these guys. Vinland Knife Fighting Guild coming on here. These guys are doing some really interesting stuff. Not only with like knife fighting, old Viking tactics, war tactics. These guys are also bringing about my stuff, the gutter fighting stuff from FAIRBAIRN. Not my stuff, but FAIRBAIRN stuff. And this is something we all know that, I really enjoy talking about. These guys also are getting into like Glida, which has really fascinated me for some time now. Glida is an old, I think it's Viking kind of wrestling, grappling, martial arts, and we'll let these guys tell us more about it. So I want to welcome on Chris and Connor of Viking Knife Fighting Guild. And guys, welcome. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, it's good to be here, man. I'm really excited about it.
Yeah, thank you for having us, man. It's an honor.
Likewise. So, like I was saying, guys, can you give us a little bit of background about what you guys are doing, kind of when you started establishing yourselves, and catch us up on what you guys have been up to?
Well, we've been doing this particular project, the Vinland Knife Fighting and the Glima, for about now, mostly through researching article text. There's some scant references in the Eddas and the Sagas of Norse mythology, but that's very limited. There's a little bit more on weapons in the Sagas and the Eddas. And actually, Anthony Cummins has a book, The Illustrated Guide to Viking Martial Arts, that we would highly recommend for the Sagas and the information on weapons that has. And then after that, there's from around the 1800s a lot of masters of Glima in Iceland. They documented the style and what was available.
Yeah, and you can find those documents of those masters like on the internet in like PDF form and such. And also, just to note for the Anthony Cummins book, they also talk about the tactics implemented by the Vikings in that one. And like Connor said, they reference their combat style from the sagas. They even give you a number of references just from their lore.
Now, when I had Brian on from Old School BJJ, he made reference to Glida quite a bit. Now, for the guys and girls out there who don't know, Glida is basically Viking grappling. Am I right? Takedowns and such?
Yeah. It's stand-up. There's a little bit of groundwork, but it's not as extensive as something like BJJ.
Okay.
Yeah. It's there's also like competitive and combatives forms to it as well. There's loose hand, open hand, which is called lausatak. There's a brokatak, aka pants grip, which that's considered the Icelandic national sport, like an Icelandic national sport for them. Like that's how you would compete with that in a competitive standing. And then there's the back grip as well, which I have trouble saying the name. I have trouble saying a lot of these names, not gonna lie. But
oh no, sorry, brokatak is pants grip.
The pants is that's the back one. Back hold. And that one is more of another competitive like test of strength.
It's more about strength, well.
Yeah, I suppose that was a big thing with the Vikings, a warrior culture, strength, how strong are you? And if I'm correct, these guys would, obviously utilize weapons quite a bit. And if they didn't have their weapon for whatever reason or a job, then they would go into that kind of stand-up grappling type thing, try to slam the other guy on the deck. And
exactly, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. That's the beauty of it.
What's great about it is in competition, so they separated within the competition, Hrigspenna, the backhold style, it was more of a test of strength. And then you had styles like Brokertak, the pantshold style, or Axeltak, which is the one of the back grip styles. It's a variant of back grip that allows for more technique. And then in those, Lagerspenna actually too, that's the one that they do in the water. So you're basically trying to drown the other guy. It's a crazy sport.
That's pretty cool, man.
Yeah. But so what's very interesting to me is that in the sporting version, you had like games that were more emphasized on strength and that were more strength based for competition. And then in those games, it was all about the strength. So the Hrigspenna, it didn't really allow for technique. But then you had styles like Brokertalk or Axeltalk, which is where you have a fixed grip on the pants or on the back, and that was all about technique. Lausatalk too, it was competitive, but it was the closest to the combative form. The combative form would be called Fang. And the Lausatalk was basically like no holds barred stand-up wrestling.
Yeah.
So,
and then in the combatives, obviously it wasn't just for points or for trying to score a win. It was to survive. It was life or death. And like you said, the Vikings, yes, they had a bunch of weapons, but if for whatever reason they dropped something, that was the beauty of Glima was even if you had a weapon against you, you could find a way to disarm them, take them on the ground, and end up coming out on top.
Now, how often would these Vikings be training? And specifically, how often do you think would they be training in hand-to-hand combatives?
Well,
I would say that the emphasis would likely have been more on weapons than on hand-to-hand combatives. But at the same time, I mean, when I say like Glima as a game, that was how they entertained themselves on the boats and on the islands, and whenever they went raiding, that was kind of their pastime. So I think for a warrior, the answer to that question would be their martial art probably focused mostly on weapons handling. And then the hand-to-hand combat was mostly just trained as like whenever you had time to. So like, you know, I don't know if you've met a lot of people that practice Sambo or that do the Russian kind of training styles, but the way that they train is very, I think, similar to how the Vikings would have trained, because it's, to them, it's very much like a game. It's very much, you do it for fun, and you don't really, it's, your job isn't training. Your job is whatever your job is, and your training is just something that you enjoy because it makes you tougher and you like to be tough. It was that kind of culture. So does that make sense?
No, absolutely it does. And I was reading accounts or watching a video on YouTube, I think, where it was talking about these Vikings, and they actually were only raiders during their younger years, if I'm correct. They weren't warriors for their whole life, but it was still a very important thing in their culture for the rest of their life to be tough, to be a man.
Yeah.
I don't know
masculinity.
How you might correct me on that.
So that's a very interesting question. I would say it was definitely like the Vikings were a warrior culture, as much as any other warrior culture could be called a warrior culture. Sorry, I guess that was kind of a funny sentence. But they weren't like they were it's not exactly the way you would think of them as, like, you know, brutish warrior people. They had very advanced sword technology. They had very advanced metalsmithing. They had
these guys
some
were
of the
really big on
finest boats.
Yeah, exactly. Technology, poetry.
Technology, exactly. Yeah, poetry.
Yeah.
The Eddas and the Sagas, they were only written down hundreds of years after the actual Viking Age from oral accounts from people called skalds. And a skald was somebody who memorized these huge bodies of lore, and they could pass them on as like oral tradition.
So these things, what are they called?
They were very These people, they were skalds. A skald was a person, like an Irish bard, is that they're very similar.
Okay.
Or like a historian.
And they were the lore keepers. Yeah.
Sure.
They were the lore keepers of the community.
And so these sagas were recorded hundreds of years later.
Yeah, by people. Snorri Sturluson, he was one of the writers of, I believe, the Elder Saga, the Elder Edda.
And
but he may have been the younger Edda. I get them confused sometimes. Yeah, it's hard to keep it all.
That's because these guys, it was an oral tradition. They weren't writing them down. They were passing them from family to generation. Finally, these guys wrote it down and actually put it into a text, if I'm correct.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And yeah, the same thing. That also seems to be the history of Glima. So you'll find some references in the sagas, but the sagas were more meant to be stories to preserve your culture and your heroes. So it mentioned Glima in the sense of like, oh, they were doing this Glima trick, but it was kind of considered that it would be common knowledge, like what that was. It doesn't really go into depth. It wasn't until the 1800s that you find manuals from people like Johannes Josefsson. Yeah. And he wrote a really good manual on Icelandic, called Icelandic wrestling on Glima.
Yeah, he was also the Brokatark champion of Iceland in the early 1900s, and he said that in 1874, I believe, that during the 1,000-year settlement of Iceland, the king of Denmark, I think his name was Christian IX, he came by and he was watching the natives during their camp, just seeing what they were doing, and he noticed that the natives were practicing Glima, and he became so entranced by it that he asked the best wrestlers of the time to go and perform Glima in front of him. And that's the earliest known, but just like Connor said, it's been referenced throughout the Eddas, the sagas, and if what's said to be true with it's just been passed down, it's been around longer than even the 1800s. So it's not, it just came to light in the 1800s. It's been around longer, possibly since the founding of Iceland.
Well, yeah, you can see from the references in the sagas that it dates back to the Viking Age, and that they had a system of techniques that was probably fairly common knowledge, because it's referenced in the Eddas, and that would date it back at least 1,000 years, because the last Viking raids happened in 900.
Now, how
900
did you
AD.
guys get interested in all of this Viking stuff?
So I guess it was kind of a spiritual journey in that, yeah, we got really into, I don't know if you've heard of a satru.
I have not.
Okay, so it's like the Viking, or I guess it's not necessarily the Viking religion, because there's not really an unbroken lineage. But what it is it's a modern attempt at reconstructing the pagan religion that was wiped out by the conversion to Christianity.
Yeah. So they honor for Asatru, they're said to honor the Aesir. So that would include like Odin, Thor, and it's to honor those gods. And so from there, we went from getting interested to Asatru and just researching about Viking martial arts and historical European martial arts, because we're both martial artists by nature. Between the two of us, we have at least a collective knowledge of 20 plus years of martial arts. Me being from a Taekwondo background to I also still practice Kung Fu, Wing Chun Kung Fu to be exact. So going from that perspective and then learning about a Viking martial art, it just came natural to be interested to do that as well.
Yeah, and so this this religious spiritual, you had a name for it. What's the name of this?
A satru.
A satru, yeah.
Satru, huh? And
Yeah.
that is, I mean, that's like, I don't know if guys and girls out there have heard of Odinism, but is that similar?
Well, Odinism, there's so Odinism to a lot of people can be related to white supremacy.
Okay.
Which is something that we do our best to distance ourselves from, because we're really not about that sort of thing at all.
On top of that, Odin himself is considered like half giant. So by all intents and purposes through the lore, he himself is mixed race. So these white supremacists themselves are basically just bastardizing the image and the ideas of that. So they don't really even know what they're saying.
I had no idea that was related to white supremacy, just for everybody's information out there.
Well, it isn't always, just to be totally clear.
Okay.
Like,
it's
not
Thanks
always.
for clarification on that.
Odin means a lot of things to a lot of people. It's just that the Nazis were also into it.
The Nazis,
like, that's why they have runes on a lot of their stuff. They were into a lot of stuff, right? They were into a lot of black magic.
So, getting back to the actual martial arts now, as I do want to circle back around to this
a lot easier
religion here, the Astaru or whatever, but you know, I do want to definitely ask you guys about the knife fighting. Now, this is something that's really fascinating to me. Is the Vikings, obviously, they would have their long sword and I guess a shorter sword. Like the samurai, if I'm correct.
It's similar, yeah. They'd have a long sword or a one-handed sword usually. The famous design and the famous make is the Ulfbert or the wolf tooth.
Okay.
And then the shorter weapon was called a sax, or it's spelled S-E-A-X, like Sikhs.
Okay.
But it's pronounced sax usually.
Yeah. And the interesting design of that blade is if you take a standard knife and just flip it around, that like the blunt end for the set. So if you flip a regular blade around and the sharp end's facing you, that would be blunt. But for the sax, the blunt end of a normal knife would be the sharp end. So it's kind of like a reverse blade.
And did they do that because of the way that they would hold it, that Psycho Ice Pick style?
Yeah, because traditionally it was worn on the back. So when you were to draw it, it would be in a reverse ice pick grip, and then the sharp end would be facing down already. So it'd be ready to go.
And that's the way that they like to fight, was that reverse grip.
Yeah, that was the way that they wore it. Based on like archaeological digs of Viking graves, that was the way they would have worn their knife. So logically, that would have been the way that they would have drawn it.
Interesting. Now, what about with the longer sword? How would these guys have possibly trained? Would they do a lot of sparring with wooden swords? Would they, cut haystacks? What would they be doing there?
Okay, so if you look at the history of European martial arts, for fencing, which is really like training for swordplay, there's two types. There's the point fencing, where that's like Olympic fencing, where you use the point of the sword. And then there's cut and thrust fencing, and that's where you use both the body of the sword and the tip of the sword. The design of the Viking sword is a cut and thrust sword. It's a one-handed cut and thrust sword. So if you look at like any standard military manual from the historical European martial arts, it was probably very similar.
Okay.
Most people in HEMA especially like Celtic wrestling, Celtic martial arts, which a lot of people would consider Glima to be a part of. They believe that there's sort of a panspermia theory on how this came about, and that it all sort of descends from one source somewhere in pre-Middle Age Europe.
Interesting. Now, how did you guys get interested in the FAIRBAIRN stuff? I mean, I realize, Christian, that you're from a Wing Chun Taekwondo background, and Connor, what is your background in martial arts?
So I've done Taekwondo when I was a little kid, like a lot of people do.
Yeah.
And then when I was a bit of a teen, my dad, he used to work for the IRS, so he showed me some of the stuff. He was a special agent. He showed me some of the stuff that they taught him at FLETC. Then I got into Kung Fu a lot because a Christian, he was like, Kung Fu's really dope. So I looked for a place, and I got into Hung Ga. I did that for about 7 years. And now I'm mostly into the historical European martial arts and the research-based stuff, I guess. A lot because financially it's much easier to like research martial arts than it is to
Be in a
train
school.
somewhere, and be in a school. And I'm just not a rich man.
Connor, when you got into Hung Ga, can you explain a little bit about what that is to us out here? Because I've actually never heard of that.
Yeah, no problem. So have you heard of Shaolin Kung Fu?
I have, yes.
Okay. So Southern Shaolin Kung Fu it's just, there's Northern Shaolin and there's Southern Shaolin, and it depends on which legendary Shaolin temple it reputedly originates from. Hung Ga, it survived the burning of the Southern Shaolin temple because of the abbot Ji Sin. He passed it down until one of the biggest modern masters was Wang Fei Hung. Wang Fei Hung passed it down to Lam Zhou and Lam Sai Wing, and they wrote a lot of manuals. The Lam family has been really hugely influential on Hung Ga, and then Lam Zhou and Lam Sai Wing passed it to Wang Fei Hung, or sorry, not Wang Fei Hung, YC Wang, Wang Yuqing, who was my grandmaster. He taught my Sifu, who taught me.
Oh, wow. I feel like I'm reading The Art of War here with all these lineages and stuff.
It's the easiest way I could explain it.
No, it's cool, man. And, for guys out there, guys who grow up out there, I just want to interject about the Shaolin Kung Fu, which if you see the monks in the orange robes in China with the shaved heads doing the whole, wacha thing, that's Shaolin Kung Fu. And so...
Yeah, it's very different. That's not...
Yeah, that's not... So the Shaolin Temple itself, I'm sorry to interrupt,
no,
but so the Shaolin Temple originally, where all these styles came from, they were destroyed hundreds of years ago. So the Shaolin temples that are coming up, that are like out now, they were reconstructed sometime during the 1900s, and because of the popularity from Kung Fu and Hong Kong movies. And so Westerners and people all around the world, they would go and be like, hey, I want to learn from a Shaolin monk. But whenever the locals would be like, the temple's right there, it's all destroyed, they didn't want to hear that. So they created another Shaolin temple in that aspect. And on top of that, during the Mao Zedong's reign, he himself went to great lengths to suppress legitimate kung fu, because if you think about it, if you're being a tyrannical dictator, you don't want people who are skilled in a martial art to come up to arms and rebel. That's where the popularity of the 24 form in Yang Tai Chi came into play, because Tai Chi in itself is there's so many different styles of Tai Chi, but the one most people see commonly is the 24 form, which was instituted by Mao Zedong. So
yeah, Tai Chi originally was a grappling art. It was a lot more like Glima than what you see nowadays, ironically.
Yeah.
This is interesting. This is the first time I'm actually hearing this. Now, I'm definitely not a martial arts historian in any right, but I didn't actually know that this Shaolin Kung Fu, it's actually been really watered down from what it used to be.
Oh, for sure, man.
I wouldn't say that we're martial arts historians, but we're definitely very into the history of martial arts.
About when it comes to this stuff, man. I'll give you that.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, man. Thank you. But yeah, there's a lot out there that is not, quote unquote, and I don't like saying this word, as pure as it used to be.
Well, you know, nothing is, and I think nothing really survives the ages. Unfortunately, even, you know, we can bring it back today with the FAIRBAIRN gutter fighting, right? Like, a lot of, unfortunately, what he was actually teaching guys has been forgotten. And then, you know, we've got the classic books like Get Tough and All In Fighting, which is what a lot of what survives now. But yeah, and, you know, he was teaching a lot more grappling based originally and all that stuff, but nothing really stands the test of time.
It's like a big game of telephone. My bad.
As much as they say, don't worry about it. As much as they say in a time of peace, prepare for war, in a time of peace, you're not using the skills the same way as you would in the time of war.
Sure.
So, like World War II, the FAIRBAIRN time, they had to use those skills in their day-to-day lives in the trenches. Now we don't fight like that. We can train, but it's a very different experience. You know, training even with like really hardcore dudes. If you're training in a gym and you're training. If you're like in a trench in World War II, that's different than any sort of training situation.
Well, it's real life, certainly.
I think that's why the test of time changes things.
For sure. And you know, another thing is they trained a lot harder back then. Like, they beat the shit out of each other. Whereas, most, you know, Krav studios and everything today, you're not even touching each other. You're hitting the bag, right? So yeah, it was just different. And they were different people back then. They were tougher people. They were more agile. They were more fit. Just a lot of differences. And which I suspect also for, you know, the Shaolin Kung Fu, the Glida, they were different people. They trained harder. They had a different mentality about war and life and death. So I suspect that they were just harder people back then.
Oh, yeah, exactly. A lot of people will say that traditional martial arts are bullshit, that sort of thing. Sorry, I don't know if I can say that on your YouTube.
You're good. You can curse all you want on here.
Okay.
All right. If we're worrying about that, I passed that quota a while ago. I passed that like for 5 minutes.
Yeah, I don't know. I probably have already sworn on here.
You're good, guys. If I would have said something if I was worried about it. You can fucking curse.
But so anyway, I think a lot of the FAIRBAIRN stuff and a lot of the historical stuff, the traditional stuff, I mean, if you think about it, like Krav Maga even is a traditional martial art in that Emi Lichtenfeld, he started a tradition of Krav Maga. It's not a tradition in the sense that you would think of like Aikido as a traditional martial art, but at the same time, there's a lineage that most Krav Maga instructors can trace back to Emi Lichtenfeld.
Absolutely. And Amy actually can trace his lineage back to FAIRBAIRN. I don't know if you guys have heard that or not, but obviously serving in the British Army during World War II, he would have probably been taught something from gutter fighting. If
Yeah, I
not
know that there's
that
a
general.
lot of connection in those
But
systems.
yeah, well, you know what? That whole World War II era close combat, the judo, all of that combat judo, it all kind of mixed in together, I think. So people tend to think about FAIRBAIRN as just gutter fighting and these like secret techniques, whatever. But it was all that kind of World War II judo based stuff that they were learning. But it's definitely
First, really like
fascinating.
globalized MMA. Yeah,
Yeah, well, exactly. And,
almost.
nowadays we got guys studying, a lot of this MMA stuff. Both of you, what are your kind of opinions and thoughts about BJJ MMA for today's world?
I think it's great, and people should do it. Honestly, I mean, I think martial arts on the whole is a good practice to be engaged in. I think physical culture and physical fitness. It's important for health. It's important for longevity. It's important for a lot of things.
Mhm.
I would.
Um,
I'll continue.
yeah, I think that
For
there's a difference, but I don't think that like I don't want to like say anything bad about anything different, you know?
I appreciate
And
that.
it definitely has its place.
Absolutely. And I think that, well, like you were saying, and this is really what I think makes a warrior and a martial artist is somebody who doesn't really like to trash talk other things just because it's different. Somebody, I can tell you guys are both pretty polite people, which every martial
Yeah,
artist
I try to
I've
be.
ever met who can seriously kill somebody is like the most polite person also I've ever met generally, probably because they got nothing to prove. Now, Connor, I think you were about to say something.
Nah, that
Um,
I'm sorry, Christian, I think you were about to say
yeah,
something.
yeah,
yeah,
no,
Chris.
that's all good, man. Don't trip. I just wanted to continue on with that, with what Connor was saying, and saying that I appreciate the fact that martial arts in a whole are being pushed more in the forefront. That a lot of people want to go out and practice it. Whatever style you want to do, go ahead. BJJ, I know that
BJJ is
it,
excellent.
yeah, it has quite the usage. Like if you notice, like a lot of those CCTV videos of store clerks or just regular civilians just stopping something, there's a good chance they're using something they learned in a BJJ class
Mm.
or a Krav Maga class, or because they were hitting some pads in an MMA gym. And the whole concept of MMA, mixed martial arts, that's freaking awesome, man. Like, uh, it's it's a crazy world we live in, where if you would have asked someone back 100 years ago, hey, I want to combine this style with that style with this grappling style, and I want to practice it, they would have looked at you and been like, how are you going to do that? But
Yeah, they
now,
would have got totally wigged out about that back then.
yeah, man. And Bruce Lee himself with Jeet Kune Do, that's why some people call him the father of MMA, because that's what he did.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
I guess another way to like kind of sum up the answer to your question is I think that there's a difference between. Oh, sorry, my phone fell. I have to do this in my car for reception because the rain is insane. Um, but I guess to really answer your question, you've got like combat sports versus combatives. And when it comes to combat sports, I mean that's the best way to train most of the time for fighting, because you fight how you train, and if you can make it a sport, then you can make it sort of a game, and
Yeah,
then
yeah.
you can do it more, you know?
And like you were saying, and like you were just talking about, that's kind of how
You
the
need to have
Vikings
some
were doing it, and
rules.
that's how they
Yeah.
would train as well. And they turned it into a sport so they could get more practice, do it whenever, have some fun. Not to mention that, but it's also a full contact thing, right? So I had Stephen Kesting on yesterday, and he was talking about, look, it's useless virtually unless you train it, sparring. And I think
Yeah.
he had a very valid point right there. Just to touch on that, now, how much do you guys? How much are you able to, quarantine aside, get out there and train with the rubber knives or the dull knives or however much?
Well, I mean, quarantine aside, like before the quarantine, pretty much anytime we'd see each other and hang out, which is several times a week, we'd be going at it.
Nice.
So
Yeah, and on top
yeah,
of
we
that,
get 6-ish hours a week. Usually, I'd say would be a good
Oh, that's a lot.
minimal
Okay.
amount.
Wow.
yeah, and that's with us paired. And on top of
Well,
that, we also
when we hang out, yeah.
yeah, when we also do our own training at home. But like Connor said, us hanging out usually consists of, go on, practice some stuff. All right, let's do it.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I mean it's a game. It's for fun, you know.
Yeah, and you know, I've been watching a bunch of your guys' videos, and I really like that knife stuff you've been doing. I also saw that you had, was it a makeshift Wing Chun dummy with the PVC pipes that you guys were going at it with?
We made
Yeah,
a couple of those, yeah.
Yeah, that was
yeah.
cool. Yeah, you guys have got some really solid techniques there, man. And I've actually been really wanting to get back into the whole knife fighting thing. I've been doing, you know, strict MMA for the past freaking, I don't know, 2-3 years, man. And I've kind of lost touch with that original combatives route. Is there anything that you can kind of give as advice to guys like myself, or even guys who've never experienced knife fighting or knife training, that kind of really are interested more in the street application of this stuff? What would you say to guys like that to get them kind of started along their journey, along their way?
I would say it's very difficult to find a good teacher and a good school. It's almost better to just like look at videos of like knife altercations. And if you go onto YouTube or whatever social media, whatever video site that you use, Vimeo, something like that, and if you watch like CCTV footage of people getting mugged or people getting held up at a convenience store, stuff it could happen to you, figure out how you would diffuse that with like a normal martial art. Like if you do BJJ or MMA or a traditional martial art like Kung Fu or Glima, try to figure out what you would do if you were in the shoes of somebody getting mugged. And like look at what getting mugged looks like, because in the day and age that we live in, you can find it on the internet, and you can see the reality of violence and street crime.
I think that's a very valid point too. And looking at actual case studies is extremely valuable in my opinion, because that's how you can start to see patterns of how violence actually goes down. You know, it typically follows up some sort of pattern. Exactly. And I mean, I think that that's extremely astute advice for people out there. But beyond just going ahead and, you know, looking at these altercations, kind of visualizing it in your head, which is a valid, you know, technique. If guys want to learn, you know, more about the actual techniques, I know you guys have a book coming out soon. It's not out yet.
We are working on that. Yeah. Hopefully.
Yeah.
Well, the quarantine will actually probably make that a little bit easier.
I hope so. I'm looking forward to getting
ironically
on that when it comes out. Can you tell us a little bit more about, you know, what's going to be inside this book, and, you know, a little bit more about it?
So
yeah. So
the idea of it. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. We mentioned, I don't know if we mentioned before or after the live podcast started, but the PDFs, the historical documents from like people like Thorstein Einarsson and Johannes Josefsson, we plan on including that. We plan on deconstructing that. We plan on including some other historical European martial arts techniques from historical manuals that would match up, and from the Eddas and the sagas and all of those resources sort of compile together what we've been doing and what we've been practicing, and our interpretation of that.
The idea is with this book, is to take someone who's never in altercation, confrontation, someone who has no idea about fighting, and give them a blueprint or a map to follow to give them proficiency with not just hand-to-hand, but like how Connor said, we were going to include some schema diagrams for weaponry to give them an idea of how to use whatever's at hand for them.
That's so improvised weapons, things like that.
Yeah, improvised
exactly.
weapons, traditional weapons in the sense of like a knife or a bat, like replace bat with sword, so on and so forth, you know?
Nice. Yeah. So I like that idea of, look, work with what you got. Another reason why I really am a fan of this nice stuff is you're not always going to have a gun available to you, right? You're not always going to be wanting to fight them with your damn fists. That sometimes is a bad idea. I was raised in the combatives community with the methodology of fists don't end fights. Knives and weapons end fights permanently. So
exactly, yeah.
That's such an important thing when it comes to this, actual gutter fighting or whatever you want to call it, reality-based stuff. So I think you guys are really onto something with the improvised weapons aspect of this as well.
Yeah, if you look at some of the oldest, or not some of the oldest, some of the more recent, actually. Sorry, I said that wrong. Glima historical stuff. We'll send you the PDFs.
Right.
But they talk about a slaying slab, which is basically like a pointy rock, and they'd pick you up in the backbreaker throw, very similar to the FAIRBAIRN one.
Yeah.
Throw you down on the rock, and that would be the end of the fight.
Damn.
If it was a life and death, if it was a life and death kind of fight, that was. So the planet was a weapon. I mean, they say in judo, we'll hit you with the planet, but I mean, they made use of their environment to the extent that they used rocks that were sticking out of the ground as weapons to throw people onto. It was
a way
really
to impale them almost. Yeah,
it was a really brutal, but I mean, you see, it goes to show, like, even if your weapon is a rock that's embedded in the ground, you're still using a weapon for the final blow, and that's why it was called a slaying slab.
Huh.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's brutal.
Or a little
bit.
In today's day and age, instead of a slaying slab, say you're out in the street and there's cars around you, you got a car there. You got walls around you. You got a mailbox, something.
A curb.
Yeah, a curb. You use your environment to your advantage when you can.
A balcony.
Stairs.
Just for everyone's information, we are not,
condoning. We're not condoning anything.
This is for informational purposes only.
Only, yeah.
Educational purposes.
Now, speaking of educational purposes, I would highly advise anybody out there listening who has not already checked out Vinland Knife Fighting Guild to go ahead and do so. You guys, seriously, and I'm not blowing smoke here, you guys have wonderful, wonderful information as far as close combatives techniques, reality-based techniques on your site. I've been, like I said before, nothing but impressed with what you're putting out there. I would like you guys to try to put more FAIRBAIRN stuff out there, but that's just from my own selfish fascination. And yeah, you guys are doing great stuff. Now, besides for the Instagram, how can guys get in touch with you?
Well, we have an email. It's just vinlandknifefightingguild@gmail.com. And right now, that would be the best way to do it. We're working on getting a website set up, but it's really just us and our friends. So I mean,
yeah,
like our production team is me.
It's a guy
and Chris.
with a phone. Yeah.
Yeah, I know how that goes, but you build up slowly, and you guys actually, I've noticed, and you guys are really building up a pretty solid following out there. So I encourage you to stick with it, and you guys are going to go far. You're smart cats, so.
I appreciate that, man. That really means a lot coming from you.
Yeah, man. Like, thanks for the mad props, for reals.
Well, it's been a freaking pleasure, talking back and forth with you guys. I know, we were going back and forth about some things originally, and it's been a long time coming and kind of overdue to get you on the podcast. So, guys, once again, thanks for coming on. I got to kind of cut it here. I try to keep these things a little bit shorter, but
yeah, sounds good, man.
Yeah, but I definitely want to say, guys, again, a solid thank you. And I'm going to throw all of your links down below in the bio. So I highly encourage you guys, check these mother flowers out. They are, they know what they're talking about. So
thank you, man.
Is there anything that you kind of want to wrap up with? Any advice for martial artists out there, especially during this quarantine where guys are maybe going a little stir crazy in their house? They want to train solo, even pick up, a dull kitchen knife and go at it. What can guys kind of do to keep themselves sharp during this quarantine?
So I think that if you're going to be doing any solo training, whether it's practice your techniques so your applications are sharp, no pun intended, and that you can do shadow boxing, which is just in turn just fighting in place, practicing your techniques. If you want to practice any throws, if you're able to get yourself some resistance bands or even some sturdy clothing, like sturdy jeans that you're not going to use, you can tie that up somewhere and practice your throws that way. And yeah, that's for hand to hand. For weaponry, like you said, grab something dull, or if you have training knives, go ahead. If you have someone with you in quarantine that they're willing to help you and be like, hey, do you mind coming at me with this so I can practice? Use that too. Because not only that, even if it's someone who's never trained a day in their life before, now you're introducing it to them, and who knows, maybe they'll continue on with that.
Sometimes they make better opponents because they react like somebody that isn't trained.
Yeah,
we agree with that 100%. I've been using my girlfriend as kind of a human grappling dummy, and she says I'm an asshole for it, but I don't care. And I've noticed that the reactions she gives me, they're so pure, they're so real that it actually
exactly.
It helps.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and just any last bit of advice that I would give any practitioner of any martial arts is just keep going. Don't think that where you're at is like the be all end all, because there's always more to go. And if you think that you're in a rut or you think you're doing bad, just remember everyone sucks when they begin, and it takes time to acquire skill. So just keep at it. Don't stop.
Amen to that. Amen to that. Well, guys, thanks again for coming on. Definitely follow Vinland Knife Fighting Guild on Instagram. Don't be afraid to reach out to these guys, especially, if you're on the West Coast. I know you guys are West Coast based, if I'm correct.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Close to Los Angeles. Yeah.
Outstanding. Awesome. Well, I look forward to, communicating with you guys further. Next time I'm out on the West Coast, I will definitely get in touch with you guys. Maybe we'll do some YouTube stuff and fool around. So
that sounds awesome, man.
Awesome.
Yeah, that'd be, yeah.
Good
if
stuff.
we're ever out on the East Coast, we'll definitely we'll hit you up, man.
Touch, man. We'll do some good stuff.
For sure.
All right, guys. Well, for all of our viewers out there, please remember that until next time, you are your first and last line of defense. Don't joke around about that. Stay safe out there. Don't take any risks you don't have to. And I will catch you on the next podcast. All right. Cheers, mother flowers.